Yes, ma'am.
My question is also for Bilal. You spoke of social justice, and I've
put
heard
the microphone right at your mouth, please.
Sorry, can you hear me better?
Yes, thank you.
Bilal, you spoke of social justice, and I've heard leaders in the Middle East refer to peace with justice, and it sounds like a buzzword to me. So my question to you is, in a pluralistic society such as America, do you believe Muslims should be treated as equal to other religions or superior?
Equal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
You'll forgive me, I'm terrible in names, so I'll just point, okay?
This is Dr. Jasser.
Yes, Dr. Jasser, I applaud much of what you say, and I agree that Bernard Lewis wrote a book, What Went Wrong, and this was the decline. It was the stop of advancement of the Ottoman Empire when they were at the gates of Vienna, and his argument was that they didn't keep up with the West, with Europe, and the progressive advancement of science and business and everything, that they were wedded to the past, to Wahhabi in Arabia, to the Quran, to principles that were old and archaic, and they...
Sir, if I may, that's actually a very useful context. Would you come to a question, please?
Yeah, two questions. One is, I think one of the great problems is the mosque versus the people, a clerical-based politics and separation of church and state, or a clerical state. I think that's one great problem. Another thing from your superb presentation, sir, is all this idealism with Joseph and his talking and his equality with other people and his tolerance and all that. 1,500 years later, after Muhammad, Islam expanded and conquered half the world and converted them from a man, and this is the man that you talk about who was so tolerant.
So let me just thank you for your questions and summarize briefly maybe to each of you. Would you elaborate on the tension between church and state as it plays out between mosque and state? Yeah. Is that a fair? And then I'll ask you to elaborate on the impression that Islam spread through violence and coercion. I think that was implicit in the second part. Would you go?
Yeah, I think there's two really important points that I hope you take home. One is that there's a context within Islam in which 7th century Earth did not have an example of a country like the U.S. It took Christendom 1,789 years to develop a nation based on an establishment clause. Islam was still in the as was the world in the 7th century. There was no other example, so that was the example it had. So its basis was a mixture, and it hadn't gone through the Enlightenment. And as he mentioned, Bernard Lewis talks about that very well, about the fact that that ascendancy stopped. Much of it has to do with the militancy of the Ottoman Empire and its suffocation of universities and actually the outlaw of the Arabic language, which basically froze intellectual thought. There used to be 4,000 schools of thought in Islam, and it whittled down to 12 and then down to 8. And so this was part of the problem. But that foundation put on top of it 20th century Muslim majority countries, which included secular fascist countries that basically told their populations that they had no freedom of speech. They were imprisoned, raped, murdered if they did anything against the government, but they had some freedom of speech. Where? In the mosques. They said you could talk about politics, and the politics you could talk about in the mosques were basically foreign policy. Egyptians could not talk about domestic issues, but they could talk about anti-Semitic, hate for Israel, hate for America. That was okay. So, but that was allowed only in the mosques. So slowly, over the past century, the mosques became a bastion of politics, and political Islam became the animal that the secular fascists created through Hamas and other groups as an example. And when they don't like them, they kill them. When they're helping them, they feed them. And Mubarak does that all the time with the Brotherhood. Sometimes he enables them, sometimes he imprisons them and kills them. Saudi did that with Al-Qaeda frequently too.
And I draw attention to the fact that we have a number of questioners. We'll get to you all, so we'll all be succinct.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you to respond to the implication, if not a direct question. Was Islam spread in the first place by methods of coercion and oppression?
Mm-hmm. I think many times it was spread by coercion, and many times it's spread naturally. I think the history of empires over the history intertwined with faith or not has been very similar across many ways. I mean, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. I mean, I doubt it happened through, roses and gifts.
Oh no, roses and gifts. It was roses and gifts, I promise you.
So I think by extension to go from there and say that then from there, for that reason, we should separate mosque and church. That's not what Mr. Jasser is saying, but I'm responding if that's the implication there.
Right.
But yeah, no, I don't think there's anything to hide as a historian when looking at Islam's expansion and find which parts were by conquest and coercion and which parts were by natural expansion.
But we do have a lot of work to do. Christendom went through a reformation in which they disavowed actions like the Crusades. They disavowed militant spread of their faith. I still think that we are hard-pressed to find leading imams. Qardawi himself calls the West the land of the contract versus the land of war and the land of Islam, meaning that it's not necessarily Islam yet. It's a contract because we're a minority, which means that they may change it if they become a majority. So we have a lot of work to do on that concept.
And in the interest of making sure everyone gets a chance to address the speakers, I'm going to ask the next two questioners to come to the microphone in sequence, and we'll take the responses together. So, yes, sir, please.
Okay, it's been a very one-sided discussion tonight. There are no Islamists here to represent their views, despite your sweeping prejudices against them. But as far as contradictions go, you don't believe in moral exceptions. The United States has supported Islamic extremists like Suharto in Indonesia, like the Shah of Iran, called the Mujahideen to Afghanistan to wage war against the Soviets. At the same time, the United States has attacked with its client apartheid state of Israel, the democratically elected government of Palestine. Of course,
would you come to a question, please?
Yeah. So obviously, if you don't want to see these kind of exceptions, then the reform needs to start in the United States, and you need to face up to the fact that we ourselves are guilty of what we're accusing many Islamists either rightly or falsely of.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll ask you to state your question, please, as a question.
Okay. This question is for Bilal. One of the 6 trustees of your $16 million center, Jamal Badawi, is on record for saying, he is in effect your boss, is on record saying, if you admit that God is the creator, then you also have to admit that he's the one who should govern. The establishment of the Islamic order, the establishment of the Islamic rule is mandatory. The evidence is quite overwhelming to the effect that you can't separate from the state in Islam. It's a totally alien idea. It has nothing to do with Islam at all. How do you reconcile what you told us today with the opinions of your, in fact, boss?
So again, I'll ask you to begin perhaps with a response to the first questioner, and I'll ask you to respond to the second questioner, okay?
Well, our mission of our organization is to fix our own problems within the Muslim community. I think to blame America as being all the problems in the world are America's, I would ask him to go to Muslim majority countries and live there and see what the Taliban did. There was no Americans pushing the sword of Talibans down the throats of other Muslims. I don't think that... I have actually been one of the most outspoken Muslims in the country criticizing our previous before 1989, our policies that actually one of the things I say is that every American should look in the mirror before they fill up their gas tank if they're worried about Wahhabism. So I completely believe, and I've been critical of this past however many administrations' support of the fact that our our enemy's enemy is our friend.